Over 8 billion people inhabit our planet today. We are everywhere, in cities and farmland, across mountains and deserts. We have constructed massive towers that touch the clouds, sent spacecraft to explore Mars, and woven a global network of communication across the entire globe. No species before us has ever dominated our world the way we do. Yet imagine looking back 900,000 years ago. The picture would be utterly astonishing. Across the entire world, fewer than 1,300 living human beings remained. Not 1 million, not 120,000, but merely 1,280 individuals capable of reproduction. That was it. Our entire future, everything that would become humanity, hung suspended on a thread so fragile it seems nearly impossible that we exist at this very moment. You might wonder what we nearly experienced, that sensation when you realize how narrowly you avoided catastrophe, like slamming on the brakes just meters from a truck, missing by only centimeters. This is what happened to our entire species. Except this moment lasted not 1 second, but 117,000 years. And remarkably, nobody understood this had occurred until 2023. Scientists had long suspected that humans experienced some kind of population collapse in the distant past. Our genetic diversity seems oddly limited compared to other animals. Chimpanzees, living in scattered bands across Africa, possess vastly more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. This is abnormal. It bears the signature of a bottleneck, but nobody knew how severe it truly was, or how nearly it ended everything before we began. The story begins with a researcher named Yan Zhehui from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. 5 years ago, he was conducting genetic analysis on modern human populations, attempting to understand our evolutionary history through routine scientific investigation. He examined DNA from more than 3,000 individuals worldwide, tracking mutations backward in time as if following molecular clocks. Then he noticed something unusual in the data. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures simply vanished. It was like watching a film where 99% of the actors suddenly disappear from the screen. The mathematical models were showing something catastrophic had occurred, yet the numbers were so extreme he initially doubted them. He thought perhaps he had made an error, so he reran the analysis. Because if the calculations were accurate, human ancestors had shrunk to a population smaller than a typical high school. He spent years double-checking those numbers, running the analysis through different methods, and each time receiving the same result. Approximately 930,000 years ago, 98.7% of human ancestors were erased, while the survivors remained at critically low levels for over 100,000 years. That is longer than modern humans have existed as a species. One might think our ancestors simply endured difficult times. After all, species constantly recover from threats. But this was different. When populations become extremely small, they typically do not recover. They perish. Mathematical models show that once numbers fall to around 1,000 individuals, a species enters what biologists call an extinction vortex. Genetic problems accumulate, inbreeding intensifies, and any random catastrophe can wipe out the entire group. Most species reaching such numbers vanish permanently. Yet our ancestors somehow did not vanish. For 117,000 years, they persisted, through ice ages, droughts, the extinction of countless other species. This tiny population of early humans, scattered across unknown lands, kept the flame of humanity burning when it should have been extinguished. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is the timing of when everything happened. 900,000 years ago marks the middle of what geologists call the transition from early to middle Pleistocene. This was precisely when Earth's climate broke free from its previous balance. Before this point, ice ages came and went in relatively predictable cycles of roughly 41,000 years. The planet would cool, ice sheets would expand, then warming would return. It was difficult, but still manageable. However, around 900,000 years ago, everything changed. Ice Age cycles shifted to a harsher rhythm of approximately 100,000 years. Glaciers grew enormous, covering vast regions of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by tens of meters. Ocean temperatures plummeted. And in Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate became extraordinarily harsh and dry. Imagine an early human, perhaps Homo erectus or one of its descendants, living where dense forests once thrived. Within generations, their world transformed into a barren wasteland. Water sources vanished, the animals they hunted went extinct, and plant food became increasingly scarce with each passing century and millennium. Scientists call this the perfect storm for mass extinction. And this is exactly what befell most human populations. They were wiped out. Only a minuscule group somewhere in Africa managed to survive. We do not know exactly where, we do not know how, but they endured. And this is where the story becomes even more extraordinary. During this population bottleneck, something unprecedented happened to human genetics. Two of our ancient chromosomes fused together. They simply merged into one. This is why humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusion is extraordinarily rare. It might occur once in millions of years. And it happened precisely during the event that nearly erased us. This was no coincidence. When populations are extremely small, unusual genetic changes can spread through the entire group much faster than normal. If one person experienced such a fusion and survived to have children, those offspring would inherit this trait. And in a population of only 1,280 people, such a genetic change could become universal within just a few generations. Today, every human on Earth carries this fused chromosome, all 8 billion of us. It is chromosome 2, and it holds the genetic signature of those desperate 117,000 years when humanity nearly disappeared. Scientists can pinpoint the exact location where the fusion occurred. They can see the molecular traces where two ancient chromosomes joined together. It is like forensic evidence from the most significant crime scene in human history. But chromosome fusion did not merely reduce our population. Some researchers theorize it may have triggered changes in brain development. Genes near the fusion site affect how our nervous system functions. Perhaps the genetic reorganization during the bottleneck contributed to the evolution of a larger and more complex human brain. Consider this: our intelligence, our capacity to create art, music, and technology, our ability for language and abstract thought. All of this may ultimately trace back to a genetic chance event that occurred when fewer than 2,000 people remained on Earth. The evidence of this bottleneck is recorded in our DNA like a time capsule. Every person alive today carries the molecular signature of those 117,000 years of survival. Population geneticists see it in patterns of genetic variation, in the mathematical fingerprint of near-total extinction. Yet for decades, nobody could correctly read this signal. Old methods of genetic analysis were like trying to read a book through a keyhole. Scientists could observe that something had happened in our past, but they could not see the complete picture. They knew humans had survived at least one major bottleneck, probably when our ancestors left Africa roughly 60,000 years ago. But they had no idea about an earlier and far more severe event. Only the development of new computational tools, such as the method called fitcall, created by Jan and his team, finally allowed this code to be deciphered. These new techniques can simultaneously analyze thousands of genomes and trace genetic changes reaching back nearly 1 million years. When Hui first published his results in Science in 2023, the scientific community was stunned, not only by the severity of the bottleneck, but by its extraordinary duration. Most demographic bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively brief. A volcanic eruption destroys much of a species, then survivors rapidly multiply, filling the empty ecological niche. Or disease kills 90% of a population, but the remaining 10% recovers within a few generations. But 117,000 years is no longer simply a bottleneck. It is a prolonged death throes of an entire species. Mick Ashton, an archaeologist from the British Museum who analysed this research, expressed it this way: given sufficient resources and minimal pressure on the system, in other words, somewhere in Africa there existed a pocket of stability, a refuge where a small group of early humans found everything necessary to survive, while the rest of the continent was devastated by climate change. But where was this refuge? What made it special? How did 1,280 people maintain a stable population for over 100,000 years? These questions have captivated researchers. Some believe the survivors lived near reliable water sources, perhaps near the Great Lakes of East Africa, or along river valleys that continued flowing even as climate became severe. Water brings animals to drink. Animals mean food. Water and food together mean survival. Others suggest the survivors possessed crucial technologies unavailable to other human populations. Perhaps they learned to control fire more effectively. Fire changes everything. It allows food to be cooked, making more nutrients available. It repels predators and extends the daylight, providing more hours for work and social interaction. Most importantly, it enables survival in conditions that would otherwise kill people. Archaeological evidence shows that around 800,000 years ago, human populations dramatically increased their use of fire. This timing almost perfectly coincides with the end of the genetic bottleneck and the beginning of renewed population growth. Coincidence? Probably not. Yet there is a detail that stands out particularly. The fossil record from 50,000 to 600,000 years ago is nearly empty. Between these dates, human fossils are barely found anywhere in Africa or Europe. For a long time, anthropologists called this the fossil gap and could not explain it. Now we understand why. There simply were not enough people to leave behind many fossils. When only 1,280 breeding individuals are scattered across unknown territories, the likelihood that any of them would die under conditions capable of preserving bones for hundreds of thousands of years was extraordinarily remote. It is like searching for a needle in a haystack 100 times over, except the needles have almost vanished and the stack is continental in size. The few fossils we do have from this period were mostly found in Europe and Asia rather than Africa. This suggests they probably represent human populations that were not directly part of this bottleneck. Perhaps the severe demographic collapse affected only certain groups of early humans, while others in different regions survived in somewhat greater numbers. When you think about it, this makes sense. Africa is an enormous continent with diverse climates and ecosystems. While certain regions might have become uninhabitable during the climate crisis, others could have remained relatively stable. Yet the genetic data are unambiguous. The ancestors of all modern humans, as well as Neanderthals and Denisovans, passed through this extreme population bottleneck. We are all descendants of those survivors. Of 1,280 people. Every person hearing this story carries the DNA of that microscopic population that refused to yield during the most severe climate crisis in human evolutionary history. Scientists estimate that during the genetic bottleneck, we lost about 65% of all genetic diversity. That's a staggering number. To put it in perspective, the famous founder effect, when modern humans left Africa roughly 60,000 years ago, reduced genetic diversity by only about 15%. We still feel the consequences of that loss of genetic diversity today. This is why humans are unusually susceptible to certain diseases, why our immune systems are relatively weak compared to other primates, and why genetic disorders that would be rare in more diverse populations occur quite frequently in humans. In a strange way, our weakness is proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic vulnerability we carry testifies to the fact that our ancestors were resilient enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. But the story doesn't end with mere survival. The truly incredible part comes next. About 813,000 years ago, something shifted. The population of early humans began to expand again, not gradually, not slowly, but rapidly. Within just a few thousand years, the descendants of these 1,280 survivors spread across Africa and beyond. They developed new technologies, created more advanced tools, began hunting large animals more effectively, started building shelters, and gained greater control over fire. Most importantly, they embarked on an evolutionary path that would eventually produce three of the most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the enigmatic Denisovans. The timing is too precise to be coincidence. Genetic evidence shows that the last common ancestor of all three species lived right around when the bottleneck ended. It's as if the event that nearly erased us didn't just test our ancestors' survival skills, it forged something new, something stronger, more adaptable, something capable not merely of surviving in a hostile world, but eventually dominating it. Xuanyuan Pan, one of the scientists who discovered this bottleneck, expressed it this way: "The discovery opens up a new frontier in human evolution because it raises profound questions. Where did these people live? How did they overcome catastrophic climate shifts? Did natural selection during the bottleneck accelerate the evolution of the human brain?" That last question is especially significant. Natural selection during the bottleneck. When a population becomes extremely small, evolution operates differently than usual. Normally, genetic changes spread slowly through large populations. Beneficial mutations need hundreds of generations to become common. Harmful ones take time to disappear. But in a population of only 1,280 individuals, evolution moves at remarkable speed. Beneficial traits can spread throughout the entire group in just a few generations. People with even slight survival or reproductive advantages can quickly dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors essentially lived in an evolutionary pressure cooker. Only the most clever, hardy, and adaptable individuals survived long enough to pass on their genes. Generation after generation, intense natural selection concentrated exactly those qualities that would later make humans so successful. Problem-solving ability, social cooperation, tool use, communication skills, the capacity to learn and adapt quickly to changing environments. All these traits probably sharpened and intensified over those 117,000 years of near extinction. The genetic bottleneck wasn't just something our ancestors endured. It was what made them, and us, who we are. But what did this actually look like? Existence through 117,000 years of evolutionary hardship. Let's go back further. It's now 930,000 years ago, and the world is ending. Not in a dramatic explosion or asteroid impact. Slowly, relentlessly, one failed season after another. You're part of a small group of early humans, perhaps 30 or 40 individuals. Your species doesn't even have a proper name yet, Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, depending on who you ask. The scientists still debate those details. What matters is this: you're already human enough that your children's children's children, after thousands of generations, will one day be us. And right now, you're watching your world disappear. The forests where your parents hunted are turning into scrubland, and the scrubland is becoming desert. Rivers that flowed year-round are becoming seasonal streams, then dry beds marked by cracked, parched earth. Your group is constantly moving, following water sources that keep drying up, chasing herds that grow smaller, pursuing hope that keeps slipping away. This isn't drought. Droughts end. This is the new normal. Earth's orbital cycles have shifted into an almost nightmarish configuration. Ice sheets in the north are becoming massive, locking away so much water that sea levels drop by tens of meters. The Mediterranean becomes a chain of smaller lakes. Land bridges appear between continents. But it's not the ice itself that kills your people. It's what the ice does to Africa. When enormous ice sheets form in the north, they create a kind of atmospheric barrier. Weather systems that once brought regular rain to Africa are disrupted. The monsoons that fed the continent's rivers weaken and become unpredictable. What was forest becomes savanna. Savanna becomes desert. Desert becomes nothing. Scientists have names for what happened to Africa during this period. Aridification. The continent didn't just become drier, it became catastrophically dry. Fossil records show that most large mammals went extinct. Species of antelope that thrived for millions of years simply vanished. Elephant populations collapsed. When large animals disappear, everything else follows. Predators starve, scavengers starve, and anything that depended on hunting or scavenging like early humans faced a choice: adapt or die. Most chose poorly. But your small group, your community of 1,280 people scattered across the continent, found what others missed. Perhaps it was a mountain ridge that still caught enough rain to support a few trees. Perhaps it was an underground water source that maintained springs when everything else dried up. Perhaps it was a rift valley that created its own microclimate. Whatever it It worked for 117,000 years. Now, it's important to understand what working actually meant. Forget everything you think you know about human evolution as a smooth march toward progress. During the bottleneck, there was no progress. It was only survival. Your group probably lived in communities of 20 to 30 people, extended families where everyone within a few generations was related. It had to be that way. With only 1,280 breeding individuals total, you couldn't afford to be too choosy about mates. Inbreeding was unavoidable. Genetic disorders were probably common. Birth defects, developmental problems, reduced fertility, all consequences of too small a gene pool. And yet you persisted. Daily life was brutal. Wake up, find water, find food, don't die, repeat for 100,000 years. Water always came first. In a landscape where most streams dried up half the year, knowing where reliable water sources were meant the difference between life and death. Your people probably developed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to notice signs of groundwater, to predict which seasonal beds would flow the longest. You may have learned to dig wells, simple ones, perhaps just holes scraped out with sticks and stones. But even a crude well that reached the water table could sustain a family through the dry season. Finding food was harder. Since most large game had disappeared, you could no longer rely on hunting the way your ancestors had. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists. You ate everything: insects, always insects, termestid, crickets, beetle larvae. In terms of nutritional density per unit mass, insects are among the most nutrient-rich food sources on the planet, and they reproduce quickly, so even small populations can harvest them sustainably. You ate roots, tubers, anything that grew underground where it was protected from heat and drought. You learned which plants were edible in different seasons, which were poisonous without proper preparation, which could be stored for lean times. You became masters of finding eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, any source of protein. You probably learned to follow certain animals to their nesting areas, timing your raids to maximize harvest without destroying future breeding. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you found meat. Not the massive, woolly mammals your ancestors had hunted in groups of dozens. Those had long since vanished. But smaller animals remained. A young antelope separated from its herd, a wounded zebra, an old elephant dying of thirst. This is where fire became decisive. Early humans had used fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but during the bottleneck, fire wasn't just useful, it was the difference between life and death. Cooking meat made it safer, killing parasites and bacteria that could wipe out your entire family. More importantly, cooking broke down tough proteins and made nutrients more available. From the same amount of food, you could extract more calories. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary. Many roots and tubers are indigestible or even toxic raw, but after cooking, they become crucial sources of carbohydrates. Some researchers believe this is when humans first learned to systematically process plant foods. But fire did more than improve diet. It extended the day. Without artificial light, most animals are helpless after dark. Predators hunt, prey hides. Essentially everything stops until dawn. But with fire, your group could remain active after sunset. You could work on tools, repair shelters, share information about where you'd found water or food. Most crucially, you could strengthen social bonds. And social bonds during the bottleneck meant everything. In groups so small, conflict was an unaffordable luxury. Every person was valuable. Losing a single adult to fighting, accident, or disease weakened the whole group. Losing several might mean you wouldn't survive the next bad season. So you developed cooperation skills that modern diplomats would envy. You learned to share resources even when resources were scarce. You learned to resolve disputes without violence. You learned to care for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them. And most importantly, you learned to share knowledge. When one person found a new water source, everyone heard about it. When someone figured out how to process a poisonous plant and make it edible, that knowledge spread through the group immediately. When hunters developed a new tracking technique, it became common knowledge within days. This wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a survival strategy. In such a small population, losing accumulated knowledge when someone died could be catastrophic. So you developed oral traditions, teaching methods, ways to pass information from one generation to the next. You became almost obsessed with educating children, not just in basic skills, but in everything. Where to find water in each season, which plants are safe, how to read animal tracks, how to predict weather, how to make and maintain tools. Children who learned quickly had better chances of surviving. Children who learned quickly had better chances of leaving offspring. For thousands of generations, you had been selecting for intelligence, teaching ability, and the capacity to absorb and pass along complex information. You were becoming something new. The genetic record shows that during this population crisis, the human brain started getting bigger. Not dramatically. It would become more pronounced later, but the change was already visible. Skull volumes in human fossils right after the bottleneck period were notices larger than earlier specimens. That makes sense. When survival depends on outsmarting your environment, natural selection favors bigger brains and sharper minds. Even when such a brain demands more energy, and energy was desperately scarce during the crisis. But general intelligence wasn't the only thing that developed. What really flourished was social intelligence. After countless generations living in tiny groups, people became extraordinarily skilled at reading others. They learned when to trust, when to be cautious, when to share, when to hold back. They could predict behavior in ways their ancestors never could. You developed what psychologists now call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts and intentions different from your own. It sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most sophisticated cognitive abilities in the animal kingdom, and you perfected it under the most extreme survival pressure imaginable. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse, but what we do have is remarkably interesting. Tools became more complex and more standardized, suggesting that small communities developed consistent manufacturing techniques and shared them widely. Stone implements from the later crisis period show what archaeologists call cultural convergence. Similar designs appeared across different regions around the same time. This points to communication networks between groups, trade routes, possibly regular gatherings where communities exchanged not just objects, but knowledge and genes. It's important to understand something. These 1,280 breeding individuals weren't all living in one place. Basic population genetics says they had to be scattered. But that many people in a single valley and one disaster, a flood, a drought, disease, a volcanic eruption, could wipe them all out. Evolution doesn't make that kind of mistake. So they were dispersed, likely groups of 20 to 30 people separated by hundreds of kilometers, connected by kinship and exchange, but independent enough that no single catastrophe could eliminate everyone. This created what biologists call metapopulation structure. Individual groups would emerge and vanish, go extinct, and be replaced by others, but the whole network persisted. Think of it like a whack-a-mole game, except the moles are human populations and the hammers are droughts, diseases, and climate disasters. One group gets struck and disappears, but others survive, multiply, and send colonists to repopulate vacant territories. For 117,000 years, this desperate game continued. Some generations probably lived reasonably well, finding territories with dependable resources. Others suffered terribly, watching children starve and sicken. But somehow the network held. Then, around 80,000 years ago, things shifted. The first signs were subtle. In certain regions, rainfall became slightly more reliable. After millennia of desert, grasslands began spreading again. Animal populations started recovering. The worst phase of the climate catastrophe was ending. But by this point, the people who emerged were not the same species that entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of harsh natural selection had transformed them. They were smarter, more inclined toward cooperation, better equipped for survival in harsh conditions. They had developed technologies that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. Better tools, more sophisticated fire management, improved food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had created social systems capable of sustaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across many generations. When the climate began improving, they were ready. Population growth became explosive. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those survivors spread across Africa and began moving into Europe and Asia. They carried with them every survival skill learned during the crisis, along with genetic and cultural adaptations that kept them alive when extinction seemed inevitable. These weren't just any people. They were people forged in the most severe ecological crisis our species has ever faced. They became the ancestors of everyone who came after. Every human alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years on the brink of annihilation. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We are all descendants of survivors, all products of the bottleneck, all proof that sometimes, when everything turns against life, a handful of people can prove stubborn enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes habitable again. But the story was only beginning. What happened next changed everything. Picture your ancestors just emerging from the worst climate crisis in human history. More than 100,000 years living at the edge of extinction. Tiny groups scattered across Africa, clinging to whatever refuges they could find. Then the rains returned. Not all at once, not everywhere, but gradually. Year after year, grasslands came back. Rivers that had been dry for millennia flowed again. Animals that disappeared from vast regions returned in small herds. And your people, tempered by struggle and refined by evolution, spread across the landscape in a way the world had never seen. In just a few thousand years, almost nothing on evolutionary timescales, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors multiplied into hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. They left the African region that sheltered them during the crisis and began colonizing territories empty for centuries. But here, the story becomes particularly strange. They didn't simply expand as one big human family. The genetic bottleneck did something unprecedented to human evolution. It set the stage for a crucial speciation event in our lineage. Around 80,000 years ago, that unified population of survivors began splitting into three separate groups. 3 different evolutionary paths that would eventually become 3 of the most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the enigmatic Denisovans. Usually, speciation takes hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes millions. Species diverge slowly, accumulating differences generation by generation until they can no longer interbreed. But the bottleneck compressed and accelerated everything. Those 117,000 years of intense natural selection created a kind of evolutionary coiled spring. When the population finally expanded, it shot off in multiple directions at once. Think of it this way. Take a river and force it through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. All that water pressure builds up. Then, suddenly, you remove the constraint. The water doesn't just flow, it explodes outward, carving new channels and creating new paths. That's what happened to human evolution after the bottleneck. The first group stayed in Africa. Eventually, they became the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens. But that they weren't modern yet. They were still evolving, still refining the survival skills that carried them through the crisis. The second group moved north and west into Europe and Western Asia. These populations encountered a world completely unlike what their ancestors knew: colder, more seasonal, full of new threats and new opportunities. They adapted rapidly. Within a few 100,000 years, they developed powerful builds, enlarged nasal passages, and cold adaptations that made them perfectly suited to glacial Europe. They became Neanderthals. The third group moved east, spreading across Asia and eventually reaching Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them because they left fewer fossils, but we know they existed because their DNA still shows up in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. These were the Denisovans. All 3 groups carried the genetic signature of the bottleneck: fused chromosomes, reduced genetic diversity, neural adaptations selected during those harsh 117,000 years. But they also began developing their own unique characteristics. The African population that remained faced a recovering but still challenging environment. They needed to be adaptable, inventive, able to exploit a wide range of resources as the climate continued shifting. Natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, and the capacity to develop new technologies when conditions changed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed what we now recognize as key features of modern humans: larger brains relative to body size, lighter bone structure, enhanced capacity for symbolic thinking. Most importantly, they developed what anthropologists call behavioral modernity: the ability to create art, use symbols, reason abstractly, mental tools that eventually allowed them to dominate the planet. But that lay far in the future. For now, they were just one of 3 human species competing for resources in a world still recovering from humanity's greatest climate catastrophe. Meanwhile, Neanderthals were becoming something entirely different. Having moved into Europe during the recovery period, they encountered an environment that remained brutally cold and seasonal. Winters could last 8 months, summers were short and unpredictable. They adapted by becoming incredibly robust. Neanderthal skeletons show bone density and muscle mass that modern bodybuilders would envy. They developed enormous nasal passages to warm and humidify cold, dry air. Their brains actually became larger than modern human brains, possibly as an adaptation to the complex survival challenges of the Ice Age. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became masters of the hunt. Not random scavengers like many of their predecessors, but systematic, strategic predators capable of taking down the massive mammals of the Ice Age. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups, driving large animals into kill zones. They understood how to preserve meat through long winters, probably using natural refrigeration in caves and permafrost. Particularly striking is that they developed the first systematic burial practices in human history. Neanderthal graves show signs of deliberate body placement, sometimes with grave goods. This suggests developed symbolic thinking, the ability to see death as meaningful, worthy of ritual. They weren't merely surviving, they were building culture. Denisovans in Asia were doing something similar, though we know less about their specific adaptations. But we know they were extraordinarily successful. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations shows Denisovan DNA from the Philippines to Tibet, indicating their spread across an enormous range of environments. Some Denisovan populations adapted to high altitudes, evolving genetic variants that helped them use oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. Those same genetic variants appear today in modern Tibetan populations. Evidence that ancient humans and Denisovans interbred, passing down survival genes that still help people thrive at extreme elevations. Other Denisovan groups appear to have been skilled seafarers. Evidence reveals these ancient peoples reached the islands of Southeast Asia, requiring sophisticated boat construction and navigation expertise. This suggests they achieved maritime technologies thousands of years before any other human species. Yet what's truly remarkable about all three groups is they remained connected. Despite spreading across 3 continents and adapting to radically different environments, they stayed genetically close enough to interbreed when their ranges overlapped. When modern humans and Neanderthals encountered each other after our ancestors finally left Africa roughly 60,000 years ago, they produced offspring together. The Denisovans, at various times and places, interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans. Genetic evidence shows multiple mixing episodes across hundreds of thousands of years. This tells us something profound about the bottleneck and its aftermath. That 117,000-year period of near extinction created a kind of genetic uniformity across all human populations. Although we had evolved along separate paths for hundreds of thousands of years, at our core, we remained a single species. We still carried the chromosomal signature marking us as bottleneck survivors. We still shared a basic genetic toolkit refined during those desperate millennia. But each group also developed its own specialized survival strategies. The archaeological record from this period shows a burst of technological innovation appearing not in one group, but in all 3 simultaneously. In Africa, stone tool technology became increasingly sophisticated. Simple hand axes that had dominated human toolkits for millions of years gave way to carefully crafted spearheads, scrapers, and cutting implements designed for specific tasks. More significantly, tool production became standardized. Archaeological sites across Africa reveal remarkably similar tool forms, suggesting widespread communication and knowledge exchange between groups. This signals genuine cultural evolution. Ideas spread faster than genes, allowing rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals developed their own technological traditions. They created the first composite tools, spearheads and blades attached to wooden handles using plant resins and animal sinews. This might sound simple, but it represents a serious cognitive leap. It requires advanced planning, gathering different materials, and understanding abstract concepts like leverage and torque. They also developed what archaeologists call the prepared core technique in stone tool manufacture. Rather than simply chipping stone until something useful emerged, Neanderthals learned to carefully shape stone cores so a single piece of raw material could yield multiple identical tools. This was production in the true sense, systematic, coordinated manufacture of standardized objects. The Denisovans pursued innovation too, though their achievements are harder to trace. Yet genetic analysis suggests they were the first human species to systematically use medicinal plants. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants that help process plant toxins, indicating their ancestors learned to use poisonous plants as medicines, with resistance evolving through natural selection. They may also have been the first people to practice systematic farming. Some researchers believe that Denisovan variants helping modern Asian populations digest starchy foods came from Denisovans who learned to cultivate and process wild grains. But perhaps the most crucial innovation occurred in social organization. All three human species after the bottleneck developed increasingly complex social structures. Extended family groups formed alliances with other groups. Trade networks emerged, capable of moving raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of kilometers. This was no longer mere survival. It was the beginning of civilization. Genetic evidence of this social revolution is written in our DNA. During expansion after the bottleneck, human populations show signs of what geneticists call structured mating patterns. Not random pairing, but systematic exchange of marriage partners between groups. This means our ancestors developed kinship systems and marriage rules, probably complex gift exchange networks maintaining ties between distant communities. They created social bonds that eventually allowed human societies to grow from small bands into tribes, chiefdoms, and ultimately states. But they created something else too. Something that proved even more important over the long term. Language. Nobody knows exactly when human language emerged. It doesn't fossilize. We can judge its development only through indirect evidence. But everything points to the post-bottleneck period as when human communication became truly complex. The rapid spread of standardized tool technologies suggests sophisticated information transfer. Evidence of trade networks implies negotiation and abstract thinking. Neanderthal burial practices point to symbolic thought. Particularly telling is that the genetic bottleneck created precisely the conditions where complex language would provide maximum survival benefits. Small, scattered populations trying to maintain connections across vast distances, groups needing to share detailed information about resources, dangers, and opportunities. People whose survival depended on quickly learning complex skills and teaching them to their children. In such circumstances, any improvement in communication ability offered enormous survival advantages. Those who could speak more clearly, understand more precisely, or transmit information more effectively had better chances of surviving and having children. Over hundreds of generations, this selection pressure pushed human communication abilities far beyond anything seen in other species. By the time the three human species met again, modern humans with Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovans with both groups in Asia, they were probably already capable of sophisticated spoken language. They could share knowledge, form alliances, even tell stories about ancestors who survived the Great Extinction 900,000 years earlier. But they were also beginning to face new challenges. The world was filling up again. Resources that had been abundant during recovery were becoming scarce, and the three species started competing directly for the same territories and the same resources. The age of cooperation was ending. The age of competition was beginning. Then came the meeting that would determine human destiny. 60,000 years ago, descendants of those African survivors finally left their home continent. Not all of them, just a small group, perhaps a few hundred people, who decided to cross the narrow waters between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. They didn't know they would soon encounter their long-lost relatives. For more than 400,000 years, the three human species had developed in isolation. Modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, each perfectly adapted to their environment. Each had developed their own technologies, their own cultures, their own survival strategies. Now, they would meet face to face. The first encounter probably occurred somewhere in the Middle East, possibly along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where African migrants encountered the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Picture this moment. You're a modern human, part of a small group exploring new lands. Your people have never seen other people who looked different. Suddenly, you notice them across the valley. Not people, yet not entirely unlike you. Shorter and more powerfully built than you, faces jutting forward with massive brow ridges and enormous nostrils. Bodies constructed like wrestlers, solid muscle and heavy bones. Neanderthals. The first reactions might have been fear, curiosity, or aggression. We'll never know what those initial encounters were like, but we know what happened next because it's recorded in our DNA. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight over territory, they engaged in relationships. They had children together. Genetic analysis shows multiple interbreeding episodes over thousands of years. Today, every non-African human carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the genetic signature of those ancient encounters, evidence that when our species met, at least sometimes they chose cooperation over conflict. But cooperation had limits. The Middle East during this period was like a revolving door between species. The climate shifted and modern humans moved north. It shifted again and Neanderthals pushed them back south. For tens of thousands of years, the region repeatedly changed hands. Sometimes modern humans controlled the best hunting grounds, sometimes Neanderthals. Neither could achieve lasting dominance until the rules changed. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit, a revolutionary package that made them far more effective hunters and gatherers. Sophisticated spear throwers capable of launching projectiles with deadly accuracy, bone needles allowing them to sew fitted clothing for the cold, fishing hooks and nets opening access to aquatic food sources. Most importantly, they developed systematic blade production, techniques for creating long, sharp cutting edges from minimal stone. These weren't just better tools, they were force multipliers. Technologies that let smaller groups of people accomplish what previously required much larger groups. A Neanderthal hunting party might need 20 people to bring down a mammoth. A modern human group with spear throwers and coordinated tactics might need only 8. This efficiency advantage compounded over time. Modern humans could hold larger territories with smaller populations, survive in marginal environments even difficult for robust Neanderthals, expand into new regions faster, and establish permanent settlements more easily. Neanderthals, who had thrived through ice ages thanks to physical strength and tight group cooperation, suddenly found themselves displaced by a more technologically advanced species. Yet they didn't vanish without resistance. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased violence between human groups. Neanderthal sites contain more weapons. Modern human sites show signs of fortifications. Skeletal remains display evidence of interpersonal conflict. This wasn't genocide. It was competition for the same resources between two species similar enough to want nearly the same things. Water sources, hunting grounds, shelter locations, raw materials for tools. And increasingly, modern humans won. Not because they were stronger. Neanderthals surpassed them physically in almost every way. Not because they were smarter. Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average. They won because they were more flexible. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting survival strategies for glacial Europe. They were extraordinarily good at what they did. But what they did was highly specialized. Modern humans, products of African recovery, had been selected for adaptability. They could rapidly shift tactics when circumstances changed. They could exploit new food sources. They could modify tools and methods to handle unfamiliar challenges. When climate kept shifting during that period, and it was constantly shifting, modern humans found ways to adapt. The Neanderthals, locked into survival strategies that worked well but stayed rigid, struggled. Their populations began to shrink little by little. First, they lost the best lands, the river valleys, the coastlines, the prime hunting grounds. Then they got pushed further out toward the edges, mountain valleys, northern forests, places that modern humans hadn't wanted to settle yet. By 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were living down in southern Spain and Gibraltar. Isolated groups, clinging to survival in shrinking shelters that seemed to get smaller every year. And then they vanished. Things played out differently in Asia, but followed the same basic pattern. Modern humans first encountered Denisovans around 50,000 years ago. We know less about those meetings though, because Denisovan fossils are incredibly rare. Most of what we know comes from genetic analysis, but the DNA tells a clear story. Just like with Neanderthals, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants. In some Pacific Islander groups, that Denisovan heritage reaches 6%. Unlike Europe, Asia seemed to have less direct competition between modern humans and Denisovans. The continent was so massive that different groups could occupy different ecological niches for longer. Denisovans, adapted to high altitudes, kept living in the mountains. Those who became specialists in ocean navigation held on to their island chains. Modern humans started out in different regions, river valleys, coastal plains, territories that supplemented rather than directly competed with Denisovan lands. But over time, those same technological and demographic forces that wiped out Neanderthals began affecting Denisovans too. Modern humans were simply more efficient with resources. They could maintain larger populations on the same territory. They expanded faster and founded new settlements more easily. One after another, Denisovan populations got absorbed, pushed out, or lost the competition. Some may have hung on longer than anyone expected. There's intriguing genetic evidence that modern humans were meeting Denisovans in Southeast Asia as recently as 25,000 years ago. But eventually, they disappeared as distinct populations too. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, were the only human species left on Earth. The descendants of those survivors, those 1,280 people, outlasted their evolutionary cousins, who had also descended from that same ancestral population. The three-way split that started 800,000 years ago had ended. But why did modern humans succeed where Neanderthals and Denisovans failed? The answer brings us back to that bottleneck. Those 117,000 years of near-total extinction filtered all three species down to very specific qualities: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, adaptability. But the ancestral African population, the ancestors of modern humans, faced one more challenge that their European and Asian cousins never had to deal with. Africa stayed climatically unstable even after the worst phase of the crisis passed. While Neanderthals adapted to the predictable patterns of Ice Age Europe, and Denisovans specialized for specific Asian environments, modern humans had to keep readjusting to constantly changing conditions. Droughts lasting decades would give way to periods of flooding. Seasonal rhythms shifted every few generations. Animal populations appeared and disappeared unpredictably. That constant environmental pressure kept modern humans evolutionarily flexible. Extreme specialization couldn't take hold. When the three species finally met, Neanderthals and Denisovans were like finely tuned racing machines, incredibly efficient under the right conditions, but hard to retool for new challenges.
Modern humans were more like all-terrain vehicles, not perfectly optimized for any single environment, but able to handle whatever came next. That flexibility showed up everywhere. Technology. Modern humans kept innovating, creating new tools and techniques every few thousand years. Neanderthals used basically the same stone technology for over 200,000 years. It worked, so they kept it. Social organization. Modern humans built bigger and more complex social networks. They could mobilize more people for large hunts or territorial conflicts. They developed trade connections that moved resources hundreds of kilometers. Demographics. Modern human populations could grow faster and bounce back quicker from shocks. When disease or climate catastrophe reduced a group's numbers, they recovered in just a few generations. Diet. Modern humans became extreme dietary generalists, eating everything from shellfish to mammoth meat to processed plant foods. Neanderthals stayed focused on hunting large game, effective but vulnerable when climate changes affected prey populations. But maybe most important of all, modern humans developed more complex ways to communicate. The genetic bottleneck created selection pressure for complex language in all three species. But modern humans, living in more changeable environments and larger social networks, pushed spoken communication further than anyone. They could coordinate the actions of larger groups more effectively. They could pass along complex technical knowledge more accurately. They could maintain relationships across greater distances and longer time spans. When modern humans encountered groups of Neanderthals or Denisovans, they weren't just competing for resources. They were competing with advantages in communication and organization that had been building for 400,000 years. It wasn't an even match. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They'd developed farming, permanent settlements, and complex societies. A population that once numbered only 1,280 people now included millions speaking hundreds of different languages. They'd inherited all the survival skills that carried their ancestors through the bottleneck. But they'd also developed something new, something their evolutionary relatives never quite achieved at the same level. The ability to do more than just adapt to the environment, to completely transform it. The era of human dominance had begun. And it all traces back to those desperate millennia when survival hung by the thinnest thread, and 1,280 people somehow refused to quit. And here we are now, 8 billion people everywhere. Tokyo's metropolitan area holds 14 million people. Lagos has over 15 million. New York, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. Cities so massive they're visible from space like glowing galaxies scattered across dark ground. We built the internet, connecting every corner of the planet. We cracked the human genome. We sent robots to Mars and telescopes to the edge of the universe. We created art that makes people weep and music that makes strangers dance together. We're the most successful species in life's entire history on Earth. And every single one of us, every person listening right now, every child being born at this moment, every human who ever lived, carries the genetic signature of those 1,280 people who refused to give up 900,000 years ago. That thought stops you cold if you really think about it. In your DNA are sequences that survived the worst climate catastrophe our evolutionary line ever faced. Genes that endured 117,000 years of near-total extinction and came through stronger. Chromosomes forged under incredible pressure and somehow made us more resilient. The way your brain works, how you solve problems, how you cooperate with strangers, how you learn language, how you care for children, all of that was shaped by those desperate millennia when survival demanded every possible advantage. You're living proof that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. But this discovery means more than just an impressive origin story. It explains a lot about why humans are the way we are. Ever wonder why we're so much better at cooperation than other primates? Why we can work together in groups of hundreds or thousands, while chimpanzees top out around 50? Because our ancestors spent more than 100,000 years in populations so small that cooperation wasn't just useful, it was the only way to survive. People who couldn't get along with others died. People who could share, teach, and work together lived long enough to pass on their genes. 4,000 generations of natural selection fine-tuned our capacity for working as a team. Ever wonder why humans are so obsessed with teaching?
Why we spend years of our lives just showing kids how to do things that other animals learn through trial and error? Because during the bottleneck, losing knowledge when someone died could condemn the entire group. Our ancestors who best passed information to the next generation had better chances of survival. That created an instinct for learning that lets human societies accumulate knowledge across generations. We didn't just survive the bottleneck, we became dependent on teaching and sharing what we learned. Ever wonder why we're so good with tools? Why humans can use everything from stone hammers to smartphones, while even smart animals like dolphins use tools in very limited ways? Because during the crisis years, making and using tools were literally matters of life and death. People who could invent, find better ways to get food, make fire, build shelter, they were more likely to survive long enough to have children. We evolved into a species that sees the entire world as raw material for solving problems. But the bottleneck explains some of our weaknesses too. Ever wonder why humans are so susceptible to infectious disease compared to other mammals? Why viruses that barely affect other primates can seriously knock us down? Because during the bottleneck, we lost 65% of our genetic diversity, including many immune system variants that could protect us from pathogens. We're all much more genetically similar to each other than a species our size should be, and that makes us vulnerable to diseases that can exploit those common genetic weaknesses. Ever wonder why genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease persist in human populations when natural selection should have eliminated them? Because some of these disorders may have offered advantages during the bottleneck or been side effects of traits that were selected for during the crisis. When your population drops to 1,280 people, genetic features that would normally disappear can lock into the entire species. We carry not just our strengths, but the scars of near-total extinction. But maybe the deepest consequence of this discovery is what it says about human unity. Right now, in 2025, there are people who believe racial differences between humans have meaningful biological significance. People who think populations that look different or speak other languages represent fundamentally different types of people. The discovery of the bottleneck completely destroys that idea. Every person on Earth, literally every single one, is descended from the same group of 1,280 people living 900,000 years ago. We're separated by only tens of thousands of years, and on evolutionary timescales, that's almost nothing. Any two human populations share less genetic difference than you'll find within a single chimpanzee population. We're all family, and the relationship is recent. When people departed Africa 60,000 years ago and scattered across every continent, they carried the imprint of a genetic bottleneck with them. Variations emerged: different skin tones, different facial structures, adaptations to new environments. But these weren't fundamental shifts, just different arrangements of the same core genetic alphabet. Consider the Aboriginal peoples who reached Australia 50,000 years before now. The Europeans whose lineages endured the Ice Age. The Polynesians navigating the Pacific using only charts, sticks, and stars. The indigenous peoples of the Americas who crossed during the final glacial period. Every one of them carries DNA traced back to 1,280 survivors. Every group emerged from the same evolutionary crucible. They don't exist. We do. One family, continuously written through shared struggle against impossible odds. This matters for how we face today's challenges. Take climate disruption. We're moving through rapid environmental transformation now, not as severe as what our ancestors weathered 900,000 years ago, yet serious enough to threaten human civilization. That bottleneck story cuts both ways: alarm and hope. Alarm, because previous climate catastrophes pushed human populations to extinction's edge. We're not protected by intelligence alone. Hope, because we carry genes inherited from those who survived. The ancestors who passed through that bottleneck weren't just lucky. They were adaptive, creative, able to work together, ready to completely transform how they lived when necessity demanded it. These capacities persist in us. The same flexibility that moved our ancestors from forest to grassland to desert. The same cooperation that held tiny groups together through millennia of crisis. The same problem-solving drive that built new approaches when old methods failed. We're not the same species that faced that bottleneck. We're the tested version, the refined version. The version that proved itself capable of surviving conditions that would have wiped out nearly every other large mammal on Earth. Yet survival was never guaranteed. The researchers who uncovered this bottleneck, their discovery gave us more than science. They gave us a mirror. When we examine the genetic evidence of those 117,000 years clinging to existence, we don't just see history. We see ourselves. A species that doesn't surrender. A species that discovers survival routes when survival seems impossible. A species that emerges from catastrophe changed, stronger, more capable. Yet we're also a species that could lose 99% of its numbers and spend 100,000 years hanging on before things improved. This bottleneck speaks warning and promise both. Warning, human success never was inevitable. We came far closer to extinction than most realize. Our current dominance wasn't guaranteed by special selection. It was the hard-won inheritance of ancestors who faced conditions that killed almost everything else. Promise. Our genetics carry the capacity to endure almost anything. 1,380 people looked at a disintegrating world and chose to continue. When you solve a difficult problem, you're using capabilities honed through that bottleneck. When you cooperate with someone you've just met, you're expressing behavioral patterns that sustained small populations through thousands of years. When you teach a child something new, you're part of a knowledge-sharing tradition that carried essential information through 4,000 generations of crisis. Those 1,380 live in us, not as metaphor, but literally, in our chromosomes, in our neural patterns, in our capacity for persistence. 900,000 years ago, human history seemed finished. The climate turned hostile. Disease and starvation eliminated most of our kind. Those who remained faced a world that appeared determined to erase them. They survived. They changed. They reproduced. They spread across the planet and became us. 8 billion people walk the earth today. We've constructed cities for millions, created technology connecting billions, produced art and music and writing spanning the full spectrum of human experience. We, descendants of 1,380. We. Living evidence that sometimes, when circumstances conspire against life itself, a handful of people can possess enough resilience, enough intelligence, enough capacity for cooperation to sustain hope while the world transforms into something livable again. If those ancestors could survive that, we can survive anything. The bottleneck recedes behind us. Expansion continues. The story of those 1,380 is still being written.